The only real difference between him and Basil is that he was small and had a very large henpecking wife.
So I didn't have any problems with saying what I didn't think was funny. No, I don't believe that. Why does he say that?
Long before Basil Fawlty became a household name, John Cleese was just another member of the Monty Python crew trying to find a decent place to sleep. In the early 1970s, while filming on location in the seaside town of Torquay, the Python team checked into a hotel that, by all accounts, should never have been allowed to operate. The manager running the place treated his guests less like paying customers and more like potential threats. He hovered, he scrutinized, he seemed to view ordinary hotel behavior, leaving a bag in the lobby, asking for a late checkout, holding a fork in the wrong way, as personal provocations. Cleese was fascinated. Most people would have simply found another hotel. Instead, he found himself watching this man the way a scientist watches an experiment go wrong in real time. There was something almost theatrical about how badly this manager handled basic hospitality. As if every interaction with a guest was a battle, he was determined to win, even when there was nothing to win. That experience stuck with Cleese for years. When he eventually sat down with his then-wife and creative partner Connie Booth to develop a new sitcom, that memory became the seed of an entire show. The bones of the character were all there already. The suspicion, the social awkwardness, the desperate need to appear in control while everything quietly fell apart around him. Cleese and Booth simply had to turn the volume up. What had been an uncomfortable real-life experience became, in their hands, one of the most enduring comic creations in television history. A hotel owner named Basil Fawlty, forever trying to run a respectable establishment and forever failing in the most spectacular ways possible. When Fawlty Towers premiered on BBC Two in 1975, it wasn't an instant sensation. Some early reviewers were genuinely confused by it. The pacing was frantic, the misunderstandings piled on top of each other at a dizzying rate, and the humor relied less on punchlines and more on watching a man's pride collide repeatedly with reality. A few critics dismissed it outright, unsure what to make of a comedy that seemed to revel in its own chaos. But audiences responded differently. They saw something familiar in Basil, not because most people run hotels, but because most people have, at some point, tried desperately to look competent while everything around them falls apart. Basil wasn't a villain. He was petty, snobbish, and often cruel to the people around him, but the show never let him win. Every scheme collapsed. Every attempt to impress a guest backfired. Every secret he tried to hide came spilling out at the worst possible moment. That, more than any single joke, was the engine of the show's comedy. Around him, the supporting cast gave the chaos somewhere to land. His wife Sybil could deflate him with a single look and an icy tone. The hotel's maid, Polly, was often the only person in the building behaving like a functioning adult. And the hotel's earnest, endlessly confused waiter became a magnet for disaster, absorbing the brunt of Basil's frustration in scene after scene. Together, this small cast turned a fairly simple premise, a badly run hotel, into something that felt like a pressure cooker about to explode in every single episode. The show's success wasn't immediate or guaranteed. After the first series of 6 episodes, there was genuine uncertainty about whether it would continue. It took repeat broadcasts and a slow build of word of mouth before the BBC agreed to a second series, which arrived 4 years later, in 1979. Only 12 episodes were ever made across both series. And yet, within that small body of work sat the episode that would eventually become the most talked about and most argued over half-hour the show ever produced. Part of the reason the show held together so well, despite the long gap between series and the very public breakdown of Cleese and Booth's marriage during production, was the sheer discipline behind the writing. Every episode followed a near-mathematical structure, a small lie or misunderstanding introduced early on, which Basil would then spend the rest of the episode desperately trying to manage, only for it to multiply into something far bigger by the closing minutes. Nothing was wasted. A throwaway line in the first 5 minutes would often return, transformed, as the final punchline. That kind of precision is part of why the show has aged so well on a structural level, even as individual moments within it have aged very differently. The episode in question opens with Basil in rough shape, recovering from a head injury that has left him even more unpredictable than usual. Into this fragile situation walks a group of German guests, checking into the hotel for what should be an unremarkable stay. Basil, aware that he is not exactly at his best, becomes fixated on the idea that he must avoid bringing up one particular subject in front of his new guests, the Second World War. Naturally, given who Basil is, this fixation becomes the very thing that destroys him. The harder he tries to steer conversation away from the war, the more obsessed with it he becomes, until his attempts to be a gracious host spiral into an increasingly unhinged monologue filled with wartime references. The sequence builds to a moment that will become one of the most replayed clips in British comedy history. Basil, completely out of control, marching through the dining room in an exaggerated impression that leaves his guests stunned and his staff mortified. At the time it aired, the joke landed for most viewers exactly as intended. The target of the humor was never the German guests themselves, it was Basil. His obsession with the war, his inability to let go of old grudges, and his total lack of self-awareness were being held up for ridicule. The episode worked, for many, as a satire of a particular kind of British attitude, an older generation still fixated on a conflict that had ended decades earlier, projecting that fixation onto people who had nothing to do with it. Basil wasn't making a point about Germans. He was the punchline, not the German guests. Still, even at the time, not everyone saw it that way. Some viewers felt the sheer volume of wartime references and the imagery involved went further than the satire could comfortably support, regardless of who the real target was supposed to be. The episode became one of the show's most famous, and one of its most uncomfortable to defend, depending on who you asked. For years, that discomfort mostly stayed in the background. The episode aired in reruns, was sold internationally, and became a staple of best British comedy lists. Critics who had once questioned the show's chaotic style came around entirely. By the early 2000s, Fawlty Towers was being named one of the greatest sitcoms ever made by major industry voices, with this particular episode frequently singled out as a comic high point. But television doesn't exist in a vacuum, and audiences don't watch old shows with old eyes forever. As streaming became the dominant way people watch television, decades-old programs were suddenly being seen by viewers with no memory of the original broadcast context, and by a culture having very different conversations about race, history, and what's acceptable to broadcast without comment. This shift didn't happen gradually for Fawlty Towers. It happened almost overnight, triggered by something far beyond the show itself. In the summer of 2020, in the middle of a global wave of protests and renewed public conversation about racism, a major UK streaming service quietly pulled the episode from its catalog entirely. No edited version replaced it. No warning label was added. It simply vanished, alongside a handful of other older British comedies that were facing similar scrutiny at the same time. The reason wasn't the goose step, and it wasn't really the war jokes that had caused debate back in 1975. The issue was a different character in the same episode, an elderly retired military man who appears in several scenes throughout the series, known for his outdated and often offensive remarks. In this particular episode, that character uses racial slurs while recounting an anecdote, language that had likely raised eyebrows even decades earlier, but had largely gone unremarked upon in a different broadcasting climate. For a streaming platform operating in 2020, broadcasting that dialogue without any context, warning, or edit suddenly felt like a much bigger liability than it had in previous decades. So the decision was made to remove the episode, rather than risk the backlash of leaving it untouched. The backlash came anyway, just from the opposite direction. Longtime fans of the show were furious. To them, removing the episode entirely felt like an overreaction that punished an entire piece of comedy for a handful of lines spoken by a character the show was clearly mocking, not endorsing. The character in question was never portrayed as someone to admire. He was a relic, a figure whose outdated views were part of the joke, proof of how out of step he was with the world around him, not a model for how anyone should think or speak. Within a relatively short period, the episode was restored to the platform, but not in its original form. The offending lines were cut, and the episode returned with the racial language removed and a content warning attached, alerting viewers that some material reflected attitudes of the era in which it was made. For fans who wanted to watch the unedited original, that meant the version many of them grew up with was no longer the version available on that platform. Cleese did not stay quiet about any of this. Never someone to shy away from a fight, he pushed back firmly against the idea that the episode, or the show as a whole, deserved to be treated this way. His argument was straightforward. The entire point of putting offensive language in the mouth of a character like the retired major was to expose how absurd and outdated that kind of thinking was, not to celebrate it. Removing the words, in his view, didn't make the show less racist. It just removed the joke that was making fun of racism in the first place. This argument didn't settle the debate, because the debate was never really about Cleese's intentions in the 1970s. It was about what responsibility a broadcaster has when re-airing decades-old material to a modern audience that includes people who might be genuinely hurt by language that older viewers had simply tuned out. Both sides of that argument had a point, and that's part of why this single removal sparked discussion that went far beyond one TV show. It became a flashpoint in a much wider conversation about how streaming platforms should handle the back catalog of television history, material that was made for a different era, viewed under different assumptions, and now sitting permanently available at the click of a button for anyone, of any age, in any context. For a show that had survived nearly 50 years without a single episode being pulled from broadcast, this was new territory. The episode that had once been celebrated as one of the funniest things British television had ever produced was now, for a brief but very public moment, treated as something too risky to show at all. It would be easy to frame this as the moment Fawlty Towers was cancelled, but that's not quite what happened. The show wasn't banned. It wasn't erased from history. The vast majority of its episodes remained exactly where they'd always been, still beloved, still quoted, still held up as some of the sharpest sitcom writing ever produced. What changed was that one episode, once held up without hesitation as one of the show's crowning achievements, now came with an asterisk. Watch it, but understand that some of what you're seeing reflects a different time, and not everyone agrees it should be shown the same way it always was. That asterisk has only grown more complicated as conversations about classic comedy continue. Other shows from the same era have faced similar reckonings, episodes quietly removed, jokes reevaluated, performances that once got laughs now prompting uncomfortable silence. Fawlty Towers wasn't unique in facing this kind of scrutiny. It was simply one of the most high-profile examples, precisely because of how beloved it was to begin with. The more iconic something is, the louder the reaction when it's touched at all. Meanwhile, the show's central creative force has spent the years since refusing to let the conversation drop quietly. Cleese has remained one of the most outspoken figures in British comedy on questions of so-called cancel culture, frequently returning to this exact episode as an example of what he sees as modern audiences misunderstanding satire. Whether you agree with him or not, it's hard to deny that the argument keeps Fawlty Towers in the headlines decades after its original run ended, for better or worse. There's also been talk for several years now of bringing the world of Fawlty Towers back in some form, with Cleese developing new material alongside his daughter. Plans have shifted, stalled, and been discussed publicly more than once, with no finished series ever materializing so far. Whatever shape, if any, a revival eventually takes, it's hard to imagine it avoiding the same conversation, a show built on a character whose ignorance and offensiveness were always the joke, being reintroduced to an audience far more attuned to when that line is or isn't being respected. In the end, what makes this story so interesting isn't just what was said in one episode 45 years ago. It's what that one episode reveals about how we watch old comedy now. Fawlty Towers was built entirely around a character who was wrong about everything. Wrong about his guests, wrong about his staff, wrong about himself, and stubbornly, hilariously unable to see it. That idea hasn't aged. People still recognize that kind of person instantly. What has changed is the tolerance for the specific words used to get there, and the platforms that decide what gets shown, edited, or removed entirely. The episode that briefly vanished wasn't pulled because the jokes stopped being funny. It was pulled because the world watching it had changed, and the people responsible for distributing it had to decide, almost overnight, whether decades-old context was enough to justify leaving certain lines exactly as they were. That argument hasn't been resolved, and it probably never fully will be. Every few years, a new audience discovers Fawlty Towers for the first time, and somewhere in that discovery, this same episode comes up again, sometimes as a celebrated classic, sometimes as a cautionary tale, and sometimes as both at once. Maybe that's the most fitting outcome for a show that was always about a man desperately trying to control how he was perceived, and never quite managing it. There's also something worth noting about how differently this story plays out depending on where you're watching from. In the UK, the removal and re-edit made headlines for days, debated on morning talk shows and in newspaper columns by people who had grown up with the show as part of the cultural furniture. Elsewhere, plenty of longtime fans only found out about the whole controversy secondhand, through clips and commentary online, long after the edited version had quietly become the new default. That gap between the people who lived through the moment and the people who only heard about it afterward is, in its own way, a perfect example of exactly the kind of generational and cultural disconnect the episode itself was unintentionally caught in the middle of. So here's the question worth sitting with. When an old show says something that wouldn't be acceptable today, does removing it protect anyone, Or does it just erase the evidence of how far things have actually come? Let us know what you think in the comments. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into one of British comedy's most debated moments, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories from behind the scenes of television history.